Well, welcome everybody. The last session of post-production world. Yay! Believe me, I know more than anybody. Yay! So this is to be honest with you, this is a totally self-serving session for me, right? As I've seen a lot of you around this week, you know that we're talking a lot about color and workflows and calibration and this and that. And probably about 6 to 8 months ago, I started hearing rumblings of HDR work from my clients, right? And I said, oh, well, I should start researching this. And as many of these fine folks on this panel can attest to, when I start researching something, that usually ends up in me buying something, right? I do that a lot of times, right? And so I actually, over the past couple months, have graded several HDR projects. And I'm still not sure if I'm doing it all right. I'm still not sure if I know what it all means. And I'm still not sure if, what the future of that means. So knowing some very smart people, I'll introduce this whole team in just a second. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fun and also informative for lots of other people out there to get some experts up here to talk about HDR, what it means now, what it's going to mean in the future, and some of the considerations about HDR. Of course, in our discussion, we can't be exhaustive on every particular issue about HDR, but I hope you walk out at the end of this session going, okay, yep, I get some of the terms, I get some of the key issues, some of the challenges, and some of the things that are facing us. So we're going to talk for about an hour. This is a small group, so we can open up for questions. Along the way, if something really confuses you, just shoot your hand up, and we'll talk about that. But I want to first introduce the entire team here, and the goals of what we're doing. People are like, whoa, we have some slides. Whoa.
Is there a test?
Cool. At the end of the day, I want to basically make sure we cover these kind of things, right? What is HDR? The vocab. HDR, like a lot of things in post and production, is full of vocab. EOTF, PQ, NIT, all these different terms. I hope these guys can help us clarify some of those things, right? I want to talk a little bit about HDR standards and some of the marketing involved in it. This is probably something that is a little confusing, right? We have a lot of different seemingly competing standards, but do they play nice with each other? Do they compete against each other? Where are some meant for the cinema or some meant for just home? I want to clarify and hopefully discuss a little bit of that as well. I want to talk a little bit about HDR displays. After all, HDR, as you guys will agree, is largely driven, or partly driven anyway, by the display and what it can show us. So we'll dive into that. And also calibration of those HDR displays, because calibration, of course, if you've been in one of my classes this week, you know that's very important. Talk a little bit about the future of HDR as much as we can speculate, because it's the future, right? And then, of course, your questions. I'm sure over the course, these are quite opinionated folks, so I'm sure over the course of the discussion, we will have some new questions and new issues that are raised and talked about. But to meet the panelists, you guys know me. I'm Robbie. I've been here all week. Thanks. The first panelist I want to introduce is Katie. Katie is from Light Iron. I am a huge fan of Katie's work. She's actually kind of one of my idols. I'll tap her that on Facebook and Twitter. But she is a literal tour de force of information when it comes to HDR, and I think she's going to have a ton to add to this conversation. She is kind of a senior finishing artist, right? Is your title? Yeah, up at Light Iron in New York. So she's doing a lot of HDR work for Amazon and Netflix. And she's in the front lines of deliverables and figuring out the standards and all that kind of stuff. So she's going to have a lot to add as well. We have Mr. Alexis Van Hurkman. You might know Alexis. Alexis is a prolific book author. He also works closely with the Blackmagic design team, helping implement features and documentation and stuff for DaVinci Resolve. He is a colorist, a director, producer. Is there anything you don't really do? I mean, you kind of do everything, right?
I don't act.
You don't act, okay, so, but he's a Renaissance man, let's put it that way. When I have some technical questions, he's one of the first people on my speed dial, maybe behind Ron, that I call to ask. And he's going to have a wealth of information because I think he attacks it slightly different than maybe some of the rest of the panelists, because he does do a little bit of everything, which I think is a big help to our discussion here today. Marco is I can't use the word enough. You guys are all awesome. I first actually encountered Marco at a piano bar a few years ago, right? Started talking about cameras and started talking about editing and color. You may know Marco from his fabulous ebook, Rigging Your Cinema Camera. Marco, how many pages is that book?
The ebook is over 400 pages. The printed book is like just under 300 pages.
So Marco did all that work that you just spent the past 4 days walking around the show floor to figure out which pieces of support gear go together and how they all play together. He kind of figured that part out for you, right? So it's a fantastic ebook. But Marco also has the experience, like Alexis, as a filmmaker, as a DP and shooter, and also because he runs his own shop, post-production production facility. He does it all. Edits, color correction, little audio work as well. So he has another well-rounded perspective on HDR. We have Joel from SpectraCal at the end. Like, Joel, your mind, like, it boggles me, the amount of math that you must have in your mind when it comes to things like calibration, right? And how we handle all of these standards. Joel is the Director of Advanced Research at SpectraCal. If you heard any of my classes this week, and I was bribing you with, or warning you, I should say, with SpectraCal licenses, because thank you guys for donating this to post-production world this year. This is a smart dude, knows everything about everything. A lot about the math involved with HDR workflow, LUT workflow, and that kind of stuff. So I want to rely on you, Joel, for some of the technical input about what's going on here behind some of these standards. Then we have Bram from FSI. Bram is a good friend and sort of the captain, if you will, the CEO and general manager of Flanders Scientific. Flanders, as you may know, is a monitor company. They produce high quality production and reference monitors that are used all around the world. And I said, again, he's one of my good friends that knows a lot about this HDR stuff. So we're going to rely on you from, and yes, he's coming out with, what's it, 10,000 minute monitor next week. Oh, 10,001 minute monitors, that's what it is. That's what it is. Okay. All right. And then finally, we are very honored to have Robert Carroll from Dolby. Thank you, Robert, for coming. Obviously, Dolby is one of the big names that has bounced around when it comes to HDR workflows. Anybody ever heard of Dolby Vision? Oh yeah, right? Okay. So Dolby and the research they've done with the EQF, the PQ curve, and how that was eventually ratified by CineTechGeek. This is kind of, I'm really going to dig deep with Robert because I'm really interested in the role that he sees as Dolby playing in this whole HDR landscape, how some of the standards came about, and that kind of stuff. So let's dive into it. Guys, my first question is, you know, I teach a lot, I've been at a lot of conferences, and people come up and they go, what is HDR, right? And I find that I initially have that conversation that's like, well, it's not the HDR that you think about from photographic workflows. It's not taking multiple exposures, merging them together, and still working within an SDR display. I want the elevator pitch from each of you about what HDR means to you. What is HDR in that elevator pitch kind of paragraph? Let's start with you.
Elevator pitch. Well, I'll say what I told to my DP because I'm working on putting together pre-production for a pilot episode of an action TV series that I'm doing. And I told my DP, I want to do this in HDR. I have seen it, I am convinced it is awesome. And he's like, so what's HDR? And it basically, for me, the two biggest sells are, it gives you more sparkle and pop, it gives you more contrast, and it just gives you sharpness like you can't believe if you can watch quality HDR on a quality HDR set. More importantly than that for me, it gives you more color volume, which is something that you don't get in 709. Who's here? Who's a colorist here? Or has adjusted color? You know when you have cop lights and you need to desaturate them and it's depressing. You're like, hey client, look over there. All right, now it's legal. How's it? Sure, fine. You don't have to do that. And so you get more sharpness, you get more pop, and you get more color volume. That to me is the story, personally. Just more creative freedom.
Cool. Ron, what's your pitch on what HDR means?
Well, basically building on what Alexis said, I think to summarize what you were saying, it basically makes things more lifelike. It is when people look at HDR sets, good HDR sets, it's a window into the real world. It's the way that things really look. It allows you to see specular highlights. It allows you to see detailed shadows. And it really, it does something with a television that you can do looking at the real world with your eyes. And for me, that's mostly what it's about. And there's a lot of technical detail behind it, but we'll let Joel do that.
For me, because I've been actually asked this before, and for me, it's almost like you really can't pinpoint HDR as one thing. I always say it's an actual pipeline or a workflow. There's many facets to it. It's not just the display, it's not just the camera, it's not just the grade, it's everything that flows between it. And of course, the final result is that beautiful poppy image that you can't get in Rec 709. But for me, it is a workflow pipeline in a more broader kind of sense.
Okay.
I get asked this a lot as well, and generally I prefer to tell you what HDR is not.
Okay, fair enough.
And HDR is not a brighter picture. That is like, seriously guys, it's not about making things brighter. It's about having a higher dynamic range. But I think the easiest way to explain it, without using SIMD terms, because they're boring, is actually that, like, in what we're now calling SDR, you've got between your eyes and the monitor, or whatever, to capture the display, there's like this little tiny, tiny pipe that's really just like a little straw. And you take all of this information of the world that you're seeing, and all of this detail, and everything that you can see if you have decent eyesight, and then you squeeze it through this tiny, tiny little straw. And what you get at the other end is not much, right? Compared to what we're actually seeing. Well, HDR actually opens that up and puts it through a bit more of a pipe than a straw. And I mean, the guys from Dolby will be like, bigger pipe, we've got 4,000 dents, And if you got a laser projector, then you got a giant pipe. But
maybe I should have separated those.
You're gonna be like, my pipe's bigger than your pipe, but the thing is that you're not cutting off as much in the display. You're not clipping it off at the top or the bottom or anywhere else really as much as you would before. So it's more of a bridge between reality and what you see on screen.
All right, Robert, what's obviously you're quite involved in HDR workflows these days. What's your elevator pitch?
Well, I'm going to say the exact same thing everybody else has said.
That's fine.
I'm going to use some different words.
Cool.
And that the way I like to think about it is, as Katie has said, we've always had a very restricted palette in which to work in, and we've had to force content into that palette. And as we've moved from film to digital, we lost a little of that palette because film gave us a bigger palette than we were able to do in our digital pipelines, whether that's digital cinema or home. And as digital cinema cameras got better and better, wider and wider dynamic range, bigger color gamuts, we had better raw processing power and everything else, we had the ability of capturing those images like we did in film cameras back in the digital pipeline, but then we were restricted back to your straw. Exactly. Right. So the different words I would use is that HDR, and I would include HDR and Wide Colour Gamet together, and that's, a lot of people have referred to that as an enhanced dynamic or extended dynamic range to include both the color dynamic range and the contrast dynamic range. It's about giving a bigger palette to the artist. And as Katie was saying with the light levels, it's not about having to use the entire palette. A piece of that palette is right for your story in your image at that moment. And the ideal is to provide as much palette as necessary for you to tell your story in an accurate way. And that's what HDR is.
Gotcha. And Joel, you're obviously interacting with a lot of the standards that are out there. You probably have a lot of technical information to share in just a moment. But what is HDR to you?
Well, for me, it is a lot about what has been said before. It was kind of the problem from last year, but
I was just hoping somebody would say it's just awesome.
Yeah, that's actually really more like what I say, because a lot of times I'm interacting with people that haven't seen it yet and haven't had any experience with it. And so for me, I try and just communicate that it is, vibrant, colorful, better image than you're used to seeing. Katie stole my pipe metaphor because that's actually the one that I like to use too. In that when we've been capturing with film cameras and digital cameras this much wider dynamic range, and we've always been squeezing it down into this little pipe that we've had to deliver, whether it was a film projector or a CRT display or even the latest fancy OLEDs. We have to squeeze it down to be able to reproduce it. And what HDR does is gives us a bigger, broader pipe so we can deliver beautiful, vibrant colors that add depth and clarity to images that you just don't get without this larger pipe.
Awesome. No, that sounds great. So I want to start out, I know this is a little bit of maybe a tricky situation talking about some of these standards, right? But as somebody who's started to research HDR, I get into a lot of seemingly conflicting, sometimes complementary information about what HDR, like, so somebody says to me, okay, we're Dolby Vision, and somebody else says, oh, we're HDR 10 or whatever. Now, Robert, I'm going to put you on the spot because you work for Dolby, and when I started doing my research on HDR, obviously the research work that Dolby had done with, you know, some of the science behind this, such as PQ and all that kind of stuff, was where I started learning about HDR. So tell us a little bit from your perspective, what role Dolby has played in sort of the R&D of HDR, how that came about, and you know where Dolby's kind of positioning HDR right now for cinema and home.
I just want to make a couple comments. First about your first point around standards and where we are with standards.
Yeah.
I look around this room here and I'm kind of feeling like there's a few of us here that probably were around in 1987 when we came to NAB and we saw HD TV for the first time.
Sure.
It was analog.
Yep.
It was interlaced. It was 1,125 lines. We almost adopted that as our standard at that time. It took us over 10 years to work through all the iterations and, to be honest with you, the changes that happened in technology in that time frame to get to the point where we adopted something as the standard in the US. And even at that point, we included interlaced as well as progressive, 720.
There was a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right?
We have a lot of things. So, you know, part of the difficulty is dealing with the backwards compatibility of our existing systems while looking forward and various things. So just to comment, when you look at standards today, people kind of throw up their hands and say, oh my God, there's no standards around this, what are we going to do? You know, a very highly placed individual within Pixar, it was Rick Sayer at a event this past weekend, was asked the same question around standards, and he made a really brilliant comment, as he usually does, for those of you who know Rick. And he said, you know, look, this is early, and we really don't need standards right now. What we need is we need the professionals to get the tools in their hands, figure out what works best, and see what comes out at the end is the best way to do it. And those need to become the standards. And he said, and so, you know, that's just, I just wanted to comment on the standards thing. I apologize for, you know, getting on my
Well, no, it's just one of those things that I think that somebody who's, you know, who's maybe not as learned as you guys, right? You're presented with a lot of marketing information and stuff like that. It can be hard to make heads or tails of what's what.
You know, there's definitely a big gap between the marketing, which tries to get everything down to 2 words, and the science. And sometimes it's hard to draw a correlation between that marketing and science. So just to answer your second question, you know, what we've been doing is Dolby, Dolby's been known as an audio company from the early days. A lot of people kind of got a little bit surprised as we moved into the imaging side of things, but it hasn't been a new move. The research and what we've been doing around imaging goes back well over 14 years. And so it was a number of internally image-related activities and a few key acquisitions that led us to the introduction of what we're doing both in the cinema and the home. And a lot of that is around looking at and understanding not only the base science around it and working with Cinti to build and develop the PQ standard, the Cinti 2084 standard, but also making sure that that standard is available and open and shared so that other people can adopt it. So the UHD Alliance with HDR 10, which is not a Dolby Vision thing, uses PQ. Monitors and display systems like Brahms and others that are available on the show floor uses PQ. So this is part of, you know, working toward building a base standard to build upon, while at the same time letting not only the technologists but the artists work together and collaborate and fight occasionally about what is the right way to get things done so that we can reach the right answer for our industry. And you know, if things work out well, the marketplace usually decides in the long run.
Gotcha, that's a great answer. Now I want us to take a step back before all the standard stuff, and you know, at the start of the production, like you go out and you shoot a project, right? You shoot the film. And one question I get often asked, I'm going to ask Marco and Alexis because you guys are in the field a lot shooting your own projects. Like, there's HDR cameras, right? Like, how does that work? Like, why don't like, where do I find my HDR camera? I obviously know that's not true, but could you explain to us what's going on there with cameras in the production side of HDR?
So for acquisition, you already have the cameras that you need right now. If you're shooting with an Alexa, if you're shooting with a modern Red camera, if you're shooting with a Sony F65 or 55, any camera that's been touting all this latitude that it's got.
Yeah, 15 stops, 16 stops.
Yeah, I mean, as the fellows over there were saying, like up till now, you shot all this latitude. I've got all this latitude. Here, colorist, and the colorist is like, fuck your latitude, and I'm gonna turn it into this little thing now, and that's what you get. So you already have the cameras, and in fact, the last two professional for client HDR jobs that I did weren't originally shot for HDR. They were just shot by competent DPs. And they wanted to take the opportunity to try out an HDR grade. So, you know, you already have what you need if you're shooting with a good camera.
No, but so here's my question. So, like, can I take my iPhone and you know, shoot and create HDR?
You could.
Well, then what?
So here's, I mean, my thing, and I'll hand it over to Marco because I could go on forever, but I shouldn't. But they're just signals from my perspective as a colorist. It's a signal, and you have a signal with a lot of information or a signal with not a lot of information, and then you have a target that you're fitting the signal into. So even though I'll rattle on and on about the art of it, for me, it all boils down to if I have a not very wide dynamically range signal and somebody wants HDR-ishness, I can use it. I can key the highlights and push them up, and I can make it HDR and get kind of crunchy HDR. But the more information I begin with, the smoother an HDR grade I can create.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know what the dynamic range of the iPhone actually is.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, is it a certain stop level? Is a certain, I mean, because you hear people talk about, hey, you want to have 10 bits or more, you want to have, you know, 12, 13 stops or more, like that kind of stuff.
I would love to have, like, for me, and I'll hand it over to Marco, if someone said, how many stops would you like, Alexis the colorist? I would say,
as many as you give me.
Well, I would say at least like 12, 13.
Okay. You had a question, Victor?
Yeah, yes. Sorry, this is a little rudimentary, but like, so Atomos is showing off their HDR.
Let me give you a message.
Okay, perfect. So I guess my question is really just defining HDR. So obviously, if you're recording in the log space, you have access to it, but like at what point, because Rec 709 is 6 stops, right? At what point does that display become HDR? Is it 7, is it 8, is it 10? Like, where is that actually?
That's where the standards argument comes in. Technically speaking, HDR is anything over 100 nits, which is standard SDR, so right? But
except for cinema.
Right, except that we're talking about TVs, we're talking about cinema here. So you get some people on some booths talking about how, look, we've got this HDR TV, it's 200 nits, and we go, and I go, yeah. No. So in the real world, I think most of us would probably agree that HDR is. If we want to be really nice, we'd say anything over 500. But if we want to be really realistic, it's 1,000. I mean, 1,000 nits is becoming the standard.
Sure.
But,
Can I just pop in really quick?
And the minimum, because if you see more than that, you're like, oh, I want that.
yeah. I mean, and it's what's being requested as deliverables. So.
It's like contrast. Everybody wants more.
My only thing is that you're seeing some of these displays coming out that are like, oh, we've got 1,000 nits, 1,500 nits, but nit value alone does not equal HDR. You've still got to have high contrast ratio, and even in certain aspects, is there a Dolby Vision stream coming into it? You know, what's the metadata that's actually controlling this and whatnot? So I mean, you can't just go by nit value alone. There's so many more facets to it. So that's just the one little thing that's bugging me right now in the marketing scheme of things.
Sure.
So.
Well, so let me ask you my earlier question that I haven't finished. Do you have something to shine on there?
Oh, I was just going to say one thing, which is the UHD standard addresses that. Because the spec for if you want to have an Ultra HD sticker on a TV, and I got UHD information from that guy over there, you need to have, the TV has to be able to do a specific minimum and a specific maximum. So that does address that. The shadows are important.
Yeah, the one thing with the UHD though is that one of the things that they don't specify in it at all is like how many backlighting zones they have, because they have a specific test that you need to pass, but as you know, if you know the test, you can pass the test. That doesn't mean you can make the content look good. And so I think that's one of the points where they kind of let us down, is they didn't say like, you must have at least 1,000 backlight zones or something like that, where we would be able to have some levels of confidence that with that sticker you're actually going to get good backlighting.
All right, guys, we have a question back here real quick.
I wanted to understand the difference between HDR and Wide Colour Gamet. It seems that HDR is acting like a catch-all for that as well, but I don't have a clear definition of Wide Colour Gamet.
Yeah, I'll speak about this real quick just because it's so embedded in the calibration software. You can absolutely do 709 HDR and it'll look great. You can change the color gamut out to Rec 2020 and then go back to doing 100 nits and you can do Wide Gamut SDR. They aren't interrelated in a way that you must deliver both, but now that the technology is coming out that we can deliver both, just go for it and go do both of them.
You should talk about the UHD Alliance standard though, I think that's...
Yeah, and that's probably the thing, is that with the UHD Alliance standard, what is shipping now on Blu-ray is that they've interlinked it so that when you're doing HDR, you must also then make the content Rec 2020 content. So whatever
that's the gamut side.
Yeah.
Well, that's the container, not the gamut.
Yeah. Well, that was actually exactly what I was going to say. Is that the colors must be described as Rec 2020 colors, because we don't really have any mastering monitors that are 2020 wide yet. So for the most part, people are using P3 capable monitors, and then so whatever when you're doing that, your 100% red is RGB 1.000 for 100% red, but then you need to transform it into a Rec 2020 color space before you encode it into YCC, and so it's a Rec 2020 container for your color.
Are you confused yet? Because we can add more.
Well, let me just reiterate that back to you guys and see if I got it right to maybe help this set things too. So there's the sort of HDR, the dynamic range part of it, but that is not necessarily tied to the color space that we're using for that particular project at Flinch. So I could have Rec 709 HDR, I could have P3 HDR, I could have Rec 2020 HDR, but some of the standards that are developing, like the UHD Alliance, are basically saying, hey, we've decided as a body that we would like you to use 2020. Is that more or less right?
That's right. And you can take your 709 content and then just package it as 2020 when you go to put it on the disc. So that's kind of the difference between creating the content and delivering the content.
Got it.
I actually have, I think, maybe an interesting way of summarizing it, as is expressed in DaVinci Resolve. There's a setting in your color science, and you can click a checkbox, and it gives you two settings. One setting is what gamut do you want to output, what color range do you want to output, and the other is what gamma do you want to output, which isn't anymore the right word, but it's really what do you want to do with the EOTF. And technologically, they're decoupled. You can mix and match and resolve anything you want to do. But what matters, as Katie was so eloquently saying, is what is the client going to ask you for? That is the exterior deliverable standard, I think, might be the right way to put it. Okay. The individual standards are decoupled, the deliverable standard is not.
So, Marco, we skipped over my important question with you about production, okay? Because here's what I'm curious about, right? It seems like the couple HDR projects that I've worked on have kind of just like happened to HDR by like circumstance, right? Somebody said like these museum pieces that are doing like, oh look, Samsung's sponsoring the museum with all the monitors. They want to do it in HDR. Let's do it in HDR, right? But you're a content creator. You make stories. Like, knowing what you know now about HDR and the landscape out there, are you going out with the idea of shooting and capturing and telling telling stories with HDR in mind? Or is it still kind of an afterthought?
For me, when actually acquiring the footage on set or wherever it may be, as far back as I could shoot, and this is kind of a little bit what Alexis was saying, was that I'm always, no matter what, at the very base level, trying to capture as much dynamic range as possible, even knowing I may not be able to use all that dynamic range, but to have it available in case I need to push things around or do whatever. So even to the point too of, I'm very kind of anal of always shooting at the camera's base level, 90% of the time at least, if not more, to be quite honest. Again, to have more dynamic range, lower noise. Even so far as to sometimes exposing to the right if I'm in a low contrast environment so that I can then in post bring things down so that the noise stays in control and whatnot.
Sure.
So whether it's going to HDR or not, for me, on the front end, it's like no matter what I want to have the most.
Do you also look, for example, like you did the awesome film 10/10, right? About BMW, which was the BMW thing. Like in a film like that, if you were to do it again, would you look for ways to show off the HDR possibilities, right? So it might be the glint of a wheel, right? Or like the reflection on a windshield, something like that. Just kind of like, ooh, that's awesome. Or is that doesn't really factor into your storymaking process?
It's always about how much DR I can get from the front end. Okay. And I think one thing too is, even if you may have a 1,000 nit output, or in the case with Dolby Vision, 4,000 nit output, there should be some kind of, hopefully this happens, some kind of control of not always using that much even though you have it available to you. It's having that control so you don't go overboard with crazy brightness. And, you know.
Right, because I think I used to, a couple years ago, I was doing quite a bit of stereo work, right? When stereo first came out, it was like everybody was trying to do negative parallax effects, right? It's like flash it in front of the screen and make it awesome, right? And then it kind of came to an equilibrium where people were like, oh, a little bit of depth goes a long way. You don't have to be so campy about it. Is that, like in your opinion, or any of your guys' opinion, is that kind of like where we might get with it? Like right now in the early days of this, we're all about sort of the catchy part of HDR, but in maybe a couple of years it kind of comes to an equilibrium where.
Can I just say something about because you wanted like talking about shooting in HDR? One of the things that I'm finding is that DPs coming in are actually finding that there are some considerations that they need to make if it's going to go to HDR that they hadn't thought about before. And usually after their first HDR project, once they get to their second one, they know that there is something different you've got to do. So the cool thing about HDR is that it's forwards compatible. We're used to having all this new technology and thinking about how it's backwards compatible. HDR is actually forwards compatible. So you can shoot something HDR because you have been for 5-10 years and put it into cinema, right? And the cool thing is, if you don't need to worry so much about standards, and the reason why we're not freaking out, of course, is because, well, you can always just go back and recolor it in HDR later, which we have actually done at Lightiron. We've been repurposing a lot of content. But one of the things that we are finding is that if you know you're going to go to HDR, there are some considerations you do need to make in production, and I'm sure you've had this experience, that you used to be able to shoot a beautiful picture of a sunset and have the people in the foreground, actors talking or whatever. And honestly, if you go outside, you remember this is like reality, if you go outside and you stare at the sun, right, and there's somebody in the foreground trying to tell you something, you cannot see their face because your eyes adjust. And it's the same in HDR, and we're finding that DPs are so used to shooting like the actor against the window or with a light right next to their head. And
in Rec 709 though.
Right, but they're used to doing that in Rec 709 because they can, right? Because it like clips. Because your faces are going to sit somewhere around 70 or 80. Right. So your faces around 70 or 80, but then the light shape, the lamp next to them cuts off at 100. And when the light next to them doesn't cut off until 1,000, but their face is still sitting at 80.
It's changing from the lighting and composition.
Right, and you can't see the actors' faces.
I'll add to that because I sat in on a session that I can't name, but it's something awesome. And we were
It's half my conversations with these guys.
right. We were just screwing around to see what was going on. There was this beautiful shot, stained glass window, people in the foreground. The window looked gorgeous. It wasn't that it was blinding, it wasn't too much. It was gorgeous, but you didn't give a fig about the two people, right? Because the window was amazing. So to talk about production a little bit, and then I'll ping it back to you guys. Luckily I did a little bit of grading, and now I'm in pre-production. So I'm like, all right, what were the problems I had, and what do I want to make sure the DP does? Two things. One, I found as a colorist that the natural highlight of the image is rarely what I wanted to be the brightest thing in the picture. So I found myself constantly, and I'm glad it's not just me.
Yeah. You're like windowing and dialing stuff.
Yeah, windowing, dialing stuff down. And what I found myself doing is cheating and finding other highlights to promote up so that I had the pop I wanted, while I kept the real highlights down because I didn't want the nose to be burning up. So I think DPs are going to be flagging things a lot more, which is going to make the shoot cost more gay.
But you still have to regulate your shadows, otherwise that's going to get noisy.
No, you do, but you don't have to. As a colorist, I'm not windowing the shadows as much as I'm windowing all these friggin' highlights.
Yeah, you're getting rid of those damn highlights because they distract from everything else in the picture.
But the other thing I also found is I never had highlights where I would have preferred them. And so my wife, Kaylin Rashke, is the production designer. We've been having a lot of conversations about, in my view, if you're going to shoot, and I do narrative, right? So that's my bias. I want the production designer thinking about HDR. I want the fabrics on the window. I want the drapes. I want everything. I want the makeup artist thinking about HDR. Do we use a little bit of glitter or not? I want the costumer thinking about HDR. I want everyone who puts a color into the picture to be on the same page so that we take the opportunities we can and we don't do something stupid.
Gotcha. All right, so let me ask you kind of an in-between question, because I got asked this 3-4 times this week throughout post-production while I'm here, right? So people came up and said, hey, look, I totally get it from a production standpoint of view, and I totally get it from like a color grading finish point of view, right? Is HDR, as an editor, something that I have to worry about?
No.
Seems pretty definitive. Moving on.
Actually, HDR is like, okay, whenever I get asked to be on one of these panels, I usually have some kind of slide if I get to speak or something. It's like HDR, it's not that big a deal.
Sure.
And the same as like with 3D. It's an editor, you weren't cutting in 3D, you were just cutting.
Yeah, bro.
So my only question though is like from the production standpoint and also from an editorial standpoint, and you have way more experience with this than I do, obviously. So, but aren't there certain things that you will be able to do or that you would do that you would totally avoid in an SDR workflow? Like where you have maybe not something spectacularly bright outside, but something that is relatively bright. And then
That's what we were talking about shooting it. But in editorial?
Well, or to use a shot or not use a shot, based on the fact that you know you're going to be able to pull out details from your
So like,
highlights.
can I reiterate that? So like if you had a shot that like as the editor is looking at that shot, in an SDR workflow they might go, let's find another take because window's blown out, high background's blown out, et cetera, et cetera. Might they make a different choice, maybe keep that in there because, hey, later on we can do something more with it?
What I want to see is more HDR moments on set. I think that's going to make a huge difference in this. I think in the editorial, I'm sorry, but nobody is, I'm a realist here. Nobody's going to have an HDR Final Cut X system or whatever the hell else you've got. You're not going to have an HDR laptop. So you're just not going to see it, and it's really not something you should be worried too much about. But if there are more HDR monitors on set, then they can actually figure, they can see it before they even start whether it's going to work or not.
Okay.
And I think an editor's job is to tell the story, and it's up to the DP and the colorist to make sure it works.
I totally agree with that. But there's one scenario, and it's something I've been thinking about as a writer. You could easily put yourself into a situation where, and this shouldn't necessarily change the edit, it'll change the grade of the edit, but it's something where I think the editor will put the colors on the spot, where you cut from someone standing by a window with light blowing in to the dark corner of the room.
Well, I want to get to this. I want to get to
that.
It seems like, and we kind of discussed this in slightly different ways, that people are talking about 500 nit monitors, they're talking about 1,000 nit monitors, of course, with Dolby and the Pulsar monitor, you have 4,000 nits. Dolby has proposed a standard going up to about 10,000 nits as.
Set the 2084 standard.
Right, 2084 up to 10,000 nits, right? Might need a substation to power that. But my question is like, as somebody who is, obviously right now this seems to be regulated a little bit to, larger production facilities and places like that. But what should I be looking for in a monitor? Is simply saying HDR as a little, badge on the front of the monitor good enough? Or what characteristics of a monitor am I looking for? Rob, let's start with you because you make monitors. What challenges what things have you heard from customers saying, oh, I'm doing HDR, I want to do HDR. What are you advising them about what's the difference between an HDR monitor and another HDR monitor?
No, I mean, people want to do HDR, there's no doubt about that, but there's a very harsh reality out there right now, and it's always this way when there's new tech, when there's HD, when there's the first 4K panels. The first few iterations of that technology, garbage. And the thing that you have to remember as a professional monitor manufacturer is that the vast majority of us, even some of the really big players, we don't make panels specifically just for this industry. What we tend to do is we go out and we source panels that are being made for a multitude of other applications.
Phones, tablets, whatever.
Phones, tablets, televisions. And what we do is we find the best of those, then we do these bidding processes where we only choose the best of them and we pay stupid premiums to get the nice ones and things like that. But there are very few applications where someone's going out and building that tech just for this professional industry. And what's kind of cool about what Dolby's doing is that's an exception to the rule. They're largely going out and building something, but then you have the fact that, what do you have? How many pulsars? 50? 100? Not even? 11? 11, yeah. So, and you need 40 amps to power it, and that's cool. I mean, somebody's got to do the bleeding edge work. And the thing is that I'm happy that Dolby's doing that because I ain't got that kind of money. But it's cool, and these things will keep filtering into the consumer world. But when I go out and we spec these panels, we look for these panels, what we ultimately keep finding ourselves experiencing is just disappointment. Because for us, what we want is you want to be able to do bright, but you also want to do contrast, and that's the combination. That is the killer combination that you need. You need brightness or luminance, high luminance, and you need contrast, good contrast. And a lot of the bright solutions out there today are basically going to have a significant elevation in the black levels too. So you don't have the contrast there. So you get into things like OLED, but I tell you what, getting OLED to 1,000 nits plus is really, really tough. But we're constantly making gains there. So I'm very hopeful about the future, but Flanders Scientific personally is a very pragmatic company. We focus on the here and now and making things affordable. And I don't think we're that far away from it, and the first iterations are going to be like right on that peak of like, oh, we can just get to 1,000 nit and we can do it over like a L20 patch or something like that. I think even the Pulsar, you're not doing 4,000 at full screen, or are you? You can? Wow. Does it hurt? It does. Yeah.
So lights go down. Like Cam said, it's not intended to be brighter. It's having the brightness.
The power meter outside.
Right.
So Robert, I'm curious. So you guys, obviously with the Pulsar, has anyone ever seen the Pulsar in action? This is it's a pretty impressive monitor. Obviously, it's very, very bright, very hot, right? Very a lot of power. You guys, when I first saw that monitor, what was that, a year or two ago here at the maybe? Something like that. I was really impressed by it, but how do you see, because you guys, sometimes make monitors, but more so it's the R&D, kind of the research component. What do you see Dolby's role in kind of this idea of, the monitor development for this work?
That's a great question. I appreciate you asking, Rob, because I think right now, and I think Ron would agree that when it comes to the whole concept of HDR and wide color gamut, workflow is one thing, but the central part of that workflow is the display system or the monitor. We're very comfortable now on the capture side, visual effects as well as acquisition on set, that's done, right? We've got that figured out. But the display systems are the most difficult, and Dolby's activity in this market has always been as a laboratory, has been as a research laboratory, and taking that research and creating the ability to license that out across not only the professional market where we play, but also the consumer market where our friends like LG and Vizio and Samsung and TCL and Sony and Toshiba and all the others play, or that matter, Amazon and Apple and where a lot of content's being consumed now. So, on the professional side, I want to just reiterate something Bram said. I think it's really important that you not only, when you look at a monitor, you take a look at the specs. Don't ask, is this a HDR reference grade monitor? It means nothing when you ask that, and people can give you any answer they want to give you. Look at the real specs. I will say that you need to get an opportunity to measure those specs. I'm sure Joel will tell you that he can help you, and Derek would love for you guys to know how to do all that as well.
Our OLEDs do 10,000 inch.
But my point there is that a spec might say it's 1,000 nits peak brightness, but that could be 1,000 nits peak brightness
over 10% of the
screen.
Right.
And that means that if you've got a sunset setting in the background and you want to really use that dynamic range, it might not be there for you if that's a large part of your image. So you really have to take a look at these things. And I'm not trying to diss the monitor manufacturers. There's a lot of different technologies. OLED has a difficult time holding up the power necessary for a large part of the screen. Even LCD does it. It takes a significant amount of power. So there's a lot of different parameters here that you just have to look at. And if you look at what the UHD Alliance is, and I'm going to do another little backtracking.
Sure, it's okay.
UHD Alliance is not a standards body. They're an alliance of manufacturers who are trying to make the recommended
practices
and branding practices. Those branding practices.
They need certain requirements if they put the brand on. Right.
Those branding practices and recommended practices could become standards by official standards bodies who follow international ISO based.
Right.
So there's this whole documentation method and how you set standards, but that's not what the UHD Alliance is doing. However, they're at the leading edge because the consumer environment is trying to put something together that the consumers can understand. We are trying to make sure we can fulfill the need for that environment, whatever that is. Okay, I'm off my soapbox again. So ask about the specs. Read the specs carefully. Try to measure them as best you can. Understand that the concept of a reference grade 1 monitor disappeared when the last CRT died in your facility. And don't ask for that anymore. And so just take a careful look. As far as Dolby goes, for those of you who have seen the Pulsar, great way you've been able to see it. Pulsar is an experiment. It is a proof of concept device. We have made a few of those, and we put them in certain locations as directed by creatives. So creatives would say, look, I want to do this piece of content using that methodology. I'm going to go to this post house or that post house. And we've decided where these things go based on the content creators telling us. And we move them around as the content creators move from place to place.
If you need a home for one of them.
There's another device we've developed that's nicknamed Maui. You may have seen Maui. There's a bunch of them out on the floor. We've built more of those. It is not 4K, it's HD. As is Pulsar. Pulsar's not 4K, it's HD. A lot of people think it looks like 4K, but
just because of contrast, right?
Contrast is resolution, and when you have contrast, your mind perceives more resolution.
Absolutely.
And so those devices, we are also doing the same with Pulsar. We are making those available to creative professionals in the market on a loan basis to do specific things, but as a proof of concept. In general, we support the Sony X300 as kind of the monitor available today for mastering. I think you were using it, right? Yeah. We support that. Our Dolby Vision workflow is supportive of that, and we are putting a lot of people on that platform to do high dynamic range development. So monitors are the Achilles heel right now, and it's a problem from the viewpoint of how we scale it, right?
Wait, and I want to touch base on monitors again in just a moment, because I think there is also a distinction to be made right between the reference environment, what we're doing there, and then kind of by the time it gets to people's homes too, right? What's going on there. But before I skip to that, Joel, I'm going to ask you, I'm a little OCD about calibration, right? I mean, I think it's something that's important, right?
Yeah,
Rob's like, another goddamn phone call. Okay, So, you know, earlier this week I did a calibration class, and, you know, we set a meter on a monitor, we talked about calibration LUTs that showed, you know, CalMan and lightning LUTs and all this kind of stuff, right? What other considerations, how has the calibration landscape changed in terms of hardware, software, et cetera, now that we're entering an HDR world?
So it's one of the things that, you know, Katie's kind of like, it's really not that hard, actually. And in the calibration, you have to wrap your mind around this whole absolute EOTF thing, which is very different than conventional, gamma, relative. Well, and relative, right? You send 100% signal, you get 100% output. You send 0% signal, you get minimum output. Well, in this world, everything's absolute. So if the black floor is, you know, 0.01, well, that's going to be actually above 0% signal. So you're going to keep sending signal, and it's going to keep being 0 until you send a signal that's above that black floor.
Right.
And then the same thing happens at the top end, where you know you're going to get peak luminance at whatever the TV does, and then everything above that is going to continue to be peak luminance. So the clipping is built into this EOTF, and that's a very different perspective than having.
Can we just have one point of clarification, because we've thrown that term around a couple times, right? EOTF,
electrical optical transfer function.
Right, and so I'm sure people have heard the term gamma, right? What's the difference between gamma and EOTF?
So gamma is
the short version.
Gamma is the exponent in a power formula, right? And so technically, the old EOTF was power formula with 2.2, 2.2 or 2.4 exponent, which is the gamma number in that formula. And so the power function was the old EOTF, and it was standardized as BT1886, which has a little bit of offset in it, which is kind of cool, and standardized the number at 2.4.
It was based on phosphor technology.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's like, you know, people talk about sRGB, and they're actually incredibly similar because they're basically just both how we characterize a CRT. So EOTF is just a more generalized term because the gamma doesn't necessarily apply anymore because it was the exponent in the power formula.
Okay, I get it. Okay. So like when it comes to calibration stuff, like hardware, pattern generators, whatever, can, like right now today, can I calibrate an HDR display?
Well, so it depends on exactly what we're talking about. This is the difference between mastering content and viewing content. If you've got, you know, the X300 and you're gonna feed it SDI, then you don't really need anything special. You just keep feeding it SDI, you turn it into its 2084 mode, and then you send the patches, and you can see that it follows the...
And meters that are out there today can read, you know, 1,000 nits or whatever?
1,000 nits is pretty easy for a meter to hit.
Okay.
When you get brighter than 1,000 nits, then the landscape changes a little bit, and you start getting a little more precise hardware that's been engineered for that kind of stuff.
Spectral reading is the biggest issue thing on the device you have.
Oh yeah, well, spectral stuff, like wide color gamut, we're like HDR, one thing, wide color gamut is a different thing. But yeah, no, you don't really need very complicated hardware. Now, when you get to the consumer side, and we're talking about putting a TV into HDR mode via HDMI and all of the metadata and info that needs to get put onto the stream in order to signal the display to kick into HDR mode, that's an entirely different story. And in that case, you do need, you know, updated firmwares or updated hardware or spoofer boxes or whatever it is to be able to spoofer boxes. Well, yeah, there's a little thing called an HD Fury that can like inject the metadata into an existing HDMI.
We had a question back here, I think.
Yeah, I was just at your booth and they talked about.
Oh, no, one second.
So I was over at your booth earlier, right across from the 3M. They're very close to Rec 2020 display, which is awesome. But they said that you have in beta being able to HDR grade.
Well, I'm sorry. Whose booth were you in?
SpectraCal.
Okay.
HDR grade.
Yes.
We only calibrate stuff. We don't grade stuff.
Well, in order to calibrate properly so that I can grade.
Oh yeah. So the PQ EOTF, DCI, with P3 with D65, 28.
So already built into your software, you have the tools to do it.
Yeah, it's all there, it's all ready to go. In fact, most of that stuff is even in the 5.6 release, so yeah, the tools are there.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
It's a two-parter for the monitor manufacturers. Do I need 2 monitors in my suite right now? One for Peoria and one for the 2 people that are in the room that are creating the content, and eventually the executives. And then the other part of it is, do I then tell my client, okay, you want this to look good in Peoria today, you're going to come back in a year, we're going to retime this when HDR is widely accepted in the commercial world? Is that where we are today?
That is actually the workflow that's being
Yeah.
accepted today, yeah.
Yeah, so let me just reiterate, let me see if I got what you're saying. Basically, hey, I'm serving both masters here, right? I might want to do an HDR grade, I might want to do an SDR grade. Do I need 2 displays to check that out in my suite?
Yes.
Yes, more or less, right? You guys are,
So
Katie, you saw that work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Flanders and Dolby aren't saying flip the switch to 709 and
Well,
Oh, yeah, you can do
no,
that.
I mean, if you have a display that's bright enough, if you have a display that's bright enough, I mean, if you have something that has excellent contrast, you can do 1000 nit, you can certainly tame that down to do 100 nit. That's not a problem. And then the second part about doing separate grades, yes, that's one approach. There's competing approaches or competing thoughts about how you do that. So that gets a little bit into the metadata and different versions of EOTFs and things like that.
All right, let me put the fat guy running back to back.
That's how he's got 25,000 steps.
Fitness and post right there. Go ahead.
In post, in HDR, is there still an upper limit for your peak luminance and a floor for your blacks?
Yes. There are still, even though there's no standard, there are deliverables. And deliverables are the standard that the network or the studio or whatever wants from you. And if it's not that, it won't pass QC. So even though we're living in a world where there is no standard, it's not anarchy. You know, I still get a list of deliverables from whatever network or studio it is, and they say, and especially with networks, because they actually do have limitations on what they can stream. When we talk networks, obviously what's Netflix and Amazon standard deliverables now is what we actually call, my lovely boss coined the term tripod of fidelity, which is basically the UHD Alliance standard, which is HDR, Wide Colour Gamet, and high resolution 4K or up. A lot of monitor manufacturers can do one or the other, and I appreciate the difficulty in getting both. But the demand is there, and that's the only reason why I have the Sony. It does both. But yeah, it's not anarchy out there. The upper limit, generally speaking, what is being asked for that passes QC and what is being asked for from me is 0 to 1,000.
Yeah, and it might be useful to mention, because I think we alluded to this when you said Joel, that it was absolute. But when you're dealing with something like PQ, your bit levels are tied to specific luminance levels. Yeah. Is what we mean by absolute, and that's something to get used to the first time you do it. The first time you see it, and you're like, why is my scope stopping there?
Yes, I've done some training on this.
Yeah, and I'll actually add to that.
Go ahead first.
Because when you look at the signal through a scope or through your computer's display, HDR output is a log-like signal.
Yeah, so it looks very flat.
So it looks terrible. It looks like garbage. And you're like, I thought this was all
because
awesome
the display
HDR. Right, the display is stretching it back out in the way that it should be. And I've been told by my betters at DaVinci that the X300 monitor does not like being overdriven at all. So like in Resolve Color Management, there's a setting you have to choose, you know, I want this output EOTF 1000 nit and we hard clip. So
actually that monitor, I mean, the ones, we have a couple of them and we shoot them to see actually what the reading is.
Could be more than that.
No, they're all actually between 997 and 999.
I take it back.
So, yeah.
So if I can
Yes,
jump
please
into
go.
my question, which is perfectly to this, so why 1,000 nits? I mean, we're at the point right now, because listening to all of this, I'm sitting here like, okay, so I'm a professional. I don't want to invest $20,000 in a reference display, yet the industry has set a standard where essentially one manufacturer has one model that almost barely gets there. Why is that a deliverable, and why is 1,000 nits the level for HDR?
Because you can walk down to Best Buy and get something that's a little bit shit, but it'll do around 800 nits, right? So, and because, you know, I mean, it's not going to have the awesome dynamic range, and your blacks are going to be, like, you know, not that good. But everybody walks into Best Buy and sees HDR and that's it. And honestly, like, from a post-production perspective, my job is, like, we always do the primary color grade for what the most number of audience members are going to see first, right? So that's why for theatrical we grade, we grade on a projector, and like for TV we grade on a monitor, right? And so, and that's got to be your first consideration. And so your first consideration is that you're going to go, all right, most people who are going to watch this in HDR today, and luckily HDR is forwards compatible, so when one day they all have 4,000 nit pulsars, then it's fine, we can forwards compatible now. But most people are going to be sitting there watching it on something that's going to go, the specular highlight's going to go, 800 to 1,000 nits, as badly as they might do it, and it's going to be UHD. Then that's what we grade, and that is the reason why.
So now then, okay, go ahead.
I was going to make a little bit of comment on today doesn't freeze and last forever.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. It's like, there's one monitor that does it this year, or maybe this month. Like next month and next year, and are all different things.
It keeps the post houses in business. We love HDR.
and Moore's Law applies to our business. Like, I mean, is everybody familiar with Moore's Law?
Yeah, of course.
Moore's Law is the technology, the price depletion curve. And that's going to apply as well.
So now, especially to Katie, who's done a lot of these workflows then, so I've got a reference grade monitor. It doesn't do 1,000 nits, but I can get it to do more than 100 nits. Can I put it into a mode that is driving it and kind of get a feel, like I want to just feel like, what does HDR kind of feel and look like? Will that give me that, or
no?
No.
So here, the issue is that anything that's not zone backlit doesn't work, because the panels only have 1001 contrast for an IPS panel, and so unless you've got zone backlighting that gives you the real HDR range, it's not going to give you the look, because you won't have the local contrast to actually see what you're supposed to be seeing.
I used to have a Dolby PRA. And before I was doing the HDR stuff, and those are so nice, right? Anyway,
also $40,000.
Well, and that does have the zone backlight.
So here's the thing. I was reading on some music group that hey, you don't have to buy an HDR monitor if you have a PRM. You can just crank it.
Just turn it up to 500.
And I asked someone from Dolby, and they were like, yes, that's true. You can crank it. We don't support it. Because it can catch fire. but yes, you can. You're right, yes. So, I mean, yes, you
it's always
can.
good to have somebody in the crowd to get it beat up.
So, you can do that, but why? Because you're really, I mean, and all these manufacturers that are like, oh, we got HDR at 200 nits, why?
I would say that you're commenting on it'd be useful to have HDR on set.
Yeah.
And I will say that, like, what is interesting is that if you we have OLEDs that max out at about 400 nit, and the thing is, you have high contrast there because your blacks are just basically a function of your ambient lighting more than anything else, whatever it's reflecting off the screen. And actually, we were talking about this earlier, is that if you're trying to do some sort of like just basic on-set QC to get an idea of, am I going in the right direction? I don't think you're going to make your final decisions on that, but that's better than viewing it on an SDR monitor.
Oh yeah. Well, and I guess the asterisk with my statement too was just that that's based on, you know, LCD technology.
Yeah.
Okay, so LCD technology needs some backlighting. Most reference monitors don't do it because with SDR you just want a nice even backlight.
And it gets tricky though in production, because then the other thing that comes into play is your overall viewing conditions, right? Because I mean, the way that HDR looks with the lights on versus the lights off is very different. And I think that's part of the challenge too, because in production environments, I mean, you can carry around the blackout tent and stuff like that, but it's difficult, and there's going to be applications where you're not going to get that. I mean, the AC is not going to have a blackout tent around.
Right.
So, you know.
Guys, we had a question up front here.
Hello. James Gardner, actually, CineTechGeek. I actually do a blog on cinema technology, and this year I'm covering high dynamic range in a big way, and I've recorded most of the stuff that was done at the Future of Summer. I've done one with Bram and a few other guys and other places, so you might want to catch it. I've got a card from me at the end. But I wanted to put something forward. I did a little while ago a video called High Dynamic Range, the Elephant in the Room, and that's the fact that cinema and television are like totally different types of HDR.
Yes.
Right? Of course.
And the sort of question I wanted to put forward to the guys up at the front here is that we're talking about television at the moment, but when we, you know, a lot of the premium content comes from cinema, so a HDR version of that sort of content is likely to be in your life, in your workflows as well. So my question to you is considering that, the monitors that we have, they can do thousands, etc. Wanting to do a grade for cinema, usually you wanted to do it on a cinema projector because of the emotional impact of a screen over a emissions display. There's all these issues. Can you comment on where you're leading and how you're approaching this new problem of this extra grade? What screens you're going to do it on? Do you have to do it on a Dolby cinema projector if you want to do that grade? What's the path?
Yes, can I just reiterate the question a little bit, right? So it's an awesome question. So I think this is a real issue that I've been thinking a lot about too, right? Because you go from the black box theater environment, right? Where like 14, 15 foot Lamberts was kind of like, you know, the standard before, right? And now we're going to what in a theater for HDR? 30, 40, something like that?
By the way, shame on you for using foot Lamberts.
What's that?
Shame on you for using foot Lamberts.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Old school. So yeah, I think that's a really valid question, because one of the things I think that gets confusing about this is that everybody's talking 800,000 nits, whatever, but we're all kind of talking in the context of direct view displays, TVs, etc. And Katie, I mean, obviously you do a lot of this, you know, translation work between, you know, films and trim passes. And what I got to thinking about this was that, like, you know, where you might be able to, you know, in the past take a cinema grade and kind of just do a quick trim pass to the Blu-ray or whatever and get it done. This is almost like starting from scratch, right?
We're doing more trim passes than before, but because now that we're in this, so we're in this like middle stage. I mean, now, like in normal feature films, we do, luckily we don't have to do SD deliverables anymore, right? So we were, for a long time, we were doing the theatrical, the HD, and the SD, right? And those are all at some level you need to trim. Sometimes you just throw that on and let it go, right? Now, then for ages, we only had to do 2 versions, which was theatrical and HD. Now we've got HDR. So we're back to having 3 versions, but like we've always done trim passes to various extents. Now for HDR, you have to do a bit more of a trim than you did before, because you can't just throw like a transfer light on it and roll with it, because you do have to consider slightly different things. Like you're going to be turning down the specular highlights a lot for HDR. So one thing that we do at Light that is a little bit controversial, and we talk to other colorists and they're like, why do you do it that way? And you know what I was talking about with how we grade, because HDR is forwards compatible, and we grade for what people are looking at primarily as, like, that's the way, that is the standard, right? So I know that our deliverable is HDR, but our deliverable is also SDR, and frankly, 99% of the people who watch the TV show that comes out this week are going to watch it in 709. So our primary creative session with it is in 709. And we are doing HDR shows. Our primary session is in 709, and we do trims for HDR. And I know people smack us over the head for that, but it is.
Yeah, it kind of seemed like the opposite, right? It would kind of seem like you'd want to start with.
No, because people think that you look at like resolution and you downscale.
Right.
But it's not a downscaling. It's different.
One thing I think would be worth adding, and I haven't had to deal with this because the work that I've had for clients has been HDR specific. It was experimental in nature, so I got to just do what I want.
Right, so if most people are watching in HDR, then do it in HDR first.
Right. But one of the things that I consistently, I've read this in the Dolby documentation, I don't know if it's publicly available, but I mean, this you mentioned externally, and it's in the manual, so it's too late anyway. But I've read it in other places that, again, the point, as you said, of HDR is not returning it up to 11. The point is HDR is dynamic range, so you get sparkles that have separation from the rest of the image. So various manufacturers have been kind of expressing that the majority of your grade, your midtones and your shadows, are going to be the same way
more or less
grade them in 709.
Actually, yeah, like skin tone is normally like if you're shooting like a white person,
70 or something.
It's 70 or 80, right? Well, in HDR, it's still 70 or 80.
Now, Marco and I were talking about this when we started talking about this, doing this panel. And this is kind of an interesting thing, because Marco, you presented at the Hollywood Post Alliance this year, kind of gave a little bit of a primer about like, hey, what HDR is and what HDR is not. And I think that we haven't made this explicit clarification, but you guys have all hinted on it. That was a great kind of way of summing it too. It's not like all of a sudden the screen just goes to the surface of the sun and everybody gets blinded, right? Right.
And so like you can't even tell it's HDR when they walk in the room. And there's a comparison with an HDR monitor.
And so, at least initially, when Mark and I started talking about this, I talked to other colors. I know Patrick and I had talked about this, right? We might have even done a podcast about it, right? It was like, oh my God, we have to protect the poor colorist's eyes because they're just going to sit there all day and get blinded by the surface of the sun. Marco, that's not right, man? Like we're talking about strategic ways, both sometimes motivated by the story, sometimes motivated later on in post just for the wow factor of giving a little something extra, right?
Just because you have it doesn't mean you should.
Right.
You got to have constraints.
Sorry, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, and it's kind of like what you're going back to on the stereoscopic stuff, where it's like, does everything need to be popping out in your face? After a while, it's like, oh my God, I've had enough of this. So there needs to be constraint. It needs to be used creatively. And again, I'm hoping that as this really starts to flourish and get out there, that the HDR spectrum of everything isn't going to be just like totally overdone. I'm a little worried that maybe it will in the beginning.
And that's my feeling. At first, it's a cool thing to show off, right? Because it's different, right? And that's kind of the way that stereo work was at first. Like everybody's like stuff's flying from the screen, and people get nauseous.
However, what's interesting is that to the first HDR commissioned TV shows were Red Oaks and Z, the beginning of everything.
Right.
Now, neither of those were actually TV shows that had anything much that made it worthy of being in HDR. Red Oaks in particular is set in the 80s. The production design is all pastels. And it's actually like, there's no explosions or anything.
The tennis balls look really cool.
Tennis balls look, but so actually, I think that's really good news.
So our aesthetic for these new things might have changed a little bit, right? Like we're prepared to not show.
I think people learn the lesson from stereo, and everyone's really scared. And I'm seeing like VR people as well.
They're more constrained, more conservative about it.
I just want to say one thing though, because I mean I totally hear what you guys are saying, and I do agree. But the contrarian thing is also like I don't want everyone to go home and go, oh shit, man, I better not have anything above 400 nits. Like it's fucking HDR. Like give yourself a little bit of fun when it's fair, when it's use it, and that's I think for me the interesting thing is going back to what we were talking about, where the midtones mainly stay where they are. I feel be a dividing line between, like right now, you're doing multiple versions, so it's in your best interest to keep the 709-ish portion of the image down there, so it's easier to do your versions. But I can easily see, from my experience, a world where everyone's got HDR. Hell with that. Like, you know, I want to have my midtones maybe up in the 200
I think that's a thing.
something.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen. I see
Yeah.
that happening. Definitely.
But if you do that, then
I mean, I don't mean all of them. I know.
Like, if it's a sunny day.
Yeah.
But even with that, you have to be careful because you start getting into like one of the other like elephants in the room with HDR, which is reflection.
Yeah.
So I mean, and this is like one of the huge challenges of theatrical is you're in such a dark environment, you have something bright on screen, and suddenly the guy next to you wearing a white shirt is ruining your viewing experience because that's all you see. And when you get glossy screens at home and things like that, it becomes a challenge. So I'm not saying you can't lift it beyond Rec 709, but like if you start putting like, you know, the middle's 500 in.
Right.
You know what? It's creeping up, I think.
Yeah.
But it's not going to go crazy because the whole thing about HDR is that it's a better reflection of real life.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
People can detect
So
when
yeah,
it's
people,
fake.
I mean,
Yeah.
you're not. I mean, you know, people's skin tones are just not that bright, unless you've got a lovely, cool, shiny head. And there's a light shining on it, and it's a really sunny day. But you know, but the reality is that most of us, if you actually were to get a light meter and put it there, and in any environment, it's about the same.
So we have about five. I'm sorry, Alexis, we have about 5 minutes left. So I just want to make sure we get to a couple of things. So go ahead.
The other elephant in the room, though, and I haven't heard anyone talk about this, and I would love to hear your guys, all of your perspectives on this, because this is the one thing. I love HDR, you've heard me, I'm bullish about it, but the thing that makes me sweat is automatic brightness limiting.
Yeah.
And I do some awesome grade, and it goes to the consumer, and their TV knocks it down and makes it look like ass automatically. So
You can't control what grandma's got from TV sets.
right, but do you guys, for example, if you're getting PC standards, do they say, please only have so much of the image be in HDR so it doesn't happen?
Yes, generally speaking. And also, one thing I really want to see happening more and more is the ability to pipe metadata down.
So that's where I kind of wanted to get to, okay? Because one of the things that's interesting about the standards, the brands, whatever, right? So like you talk about like Dolby Vision. One of the things that, from my understanding, is that it is very heavy on the mastering metadata, right? Sort of the content committee with the set and back and forth, right? You have other standards, again, my understanding of it, something like HLG or whatever, right? That doesn't really depend on metadata exchange back and forth to work. Like what is, and Robert, you probably obviously know a lot about this, what is the role of, and Joel as well, what is the role of metadata in this HDR landscape?
Yeah, so there's a lot of confusion around that, obviously, and there's a couple different roles. One is to at least provide some parameters in which the display device can be limited or controlled such that the intent of the image is somewhat the same. And I think there's really two views. One is a global type of look, like saying, as you were saying earlier, that I don't want a certain percentage of my screen to go above so many nits because I know I'm going to hit a global dimming limitation. Yeah, exactly, on a consumer device. Just a little bit of a tutorial on the Dolby Vision philosophy. Our philosophy is that we are going to look at the display and the mastering environment and grab enough metadata on a frame-by-frame, seat-by-seat basis, both at the HDR level and at the Rec 709 or SDR level, and with other targets in between as needed, because we're not, as we were talking before, we're not done today. It's going to keep going. There's going to be different things that happen. So the idea is to provide enough metadata where you can do two things. One is when that image and metadata goes to a device that has Dolby Vision processing in it, we can replicate the environment in which the image intent was created, or the environment at the colorist workstation. So the concept of image fidelity across a multitude of devices. You mentioned global dimming. If you have a chance to yet today or tomorrow to get over to our booth. We have a demonstration of PRM, which is a $40,000 reference grade monitor. It is actually a grade 1 reference monitor.
Yep.
And a 1,000 nit LG TV that we bought at Fry's last week. And the only reason we say that is we're just trying to say, look, we literally brought this off the shelf, put it here, and played back this material on it. It is a global dimming device, and you can see that there's a big difference in the dynamic range between the PRM at $40,000 and this $1,000 LG TV.
Oh, believe me, I know this. Ron knows my pain well about this. I literally bought like every LG display to try to use as like a OLED client monitor, and been disappointed for that very reason.
Well, the point of this demonstration in our booth is showing the integrity or the fidelity of that image as it was set at the color grading workstation, as it's being
the translation from one to the other, right? Sure.
And yes, the dynamic range is less, but when you look at the tonal quality of the image and the color clarity,
that translates well.
It translates very well. And yes, Katie will look at it and be able to say exactly where the dynamic range is missing information because she gets to look at it.
She carries around a Sharpie with her.
That's right. We were racing the Sharpie this year on there. But a consumer will see that as a really good replication. This is good and bad because that means when you walk into Fry's and if they turn on all the Dolby Vision sets into Dolby Vision mode, they all look exactly the same. And no one buys the expensive one. They buy all the cheap ones, right?
Now, one last question on this because we're kind of out of time, but I just want to, this is the part that I still don't get, right? So I get the grading, I get the technology, I get the monitoring technology. I render out something, right? Let's say I render out a PQ, curve, ProRes or something like that, right? I get the deliverable out. The way that this is being delivered now, for the most part, I can't, tune into channel 4 and watch HDR, right? I'm watching HDR on Netflix, I'm watching it on Amazon, I'm watching it on, soon to be Blu-ray disc, whatever. How is that metadata in the deliverable aspect handed off from, does Amazon pick up the metadata to the TV?
Yeah.
No, that's how that works.
And it's on the discs too. We've got the discs in the shop, and with our sniffers, we can look at the metadata that's on the disc. So it's like, you can look at a Fox title and go, oh, they mastered it on 1,000 nits. You can look at like a Warner Brothers title and go, oh, look, they mastered it on Pulsar.
That's the other reason why the deliverables are what they are. It's also, sorry, yeah, so whoever it was, the gentleman that was asking about what the standards and deliverables are, the other reason is because we have to actually adhere to their metadata standards. So when they are very specific about wanting us to grade to 1,000 nits and all the other things that they put in there, it's actually so that the metadata that they're piping down the line that goes with the show that I'm sending them is consistent with my intent for it. So that's
very cool. It's very cool. Do we have any last final questions before we wrap up here? Yeah, good night.
I get I'm very much a supporter of representing what the colorist intent was post in people's TVs, but I also, and I despise all the gimmicks on consuming TVs that the
motion blurring
and all that. Yeah, but at the same time, I like in my bedroom that I've got a dark environment. I'm not necessarily going to be able to mimic the ambient light environment that you're coloring in. So I like to be able to adjust that brightness, and I wonder if Dolby Vision or if any of that is taken into account with the television at the end to adjust for the
viewing environment,
the time of day, and that sort of thing. Has any of that?
Yes and no. It depends. We're really in the teething stages on the consumer displays right now, and so like the Vizio reference series left. I think they pegged out the contrast in the backlight, but they left brightness. But instead of it being a conventional SDR brightness, it was exactly the kind of control you described, where it would simply push up the midtones so that it appeared to be a brighter image. I think the original LG from last year in its HDR10 mode blocked out all the controls. So it just kind of is a display-to-display thing, and I agree that there's going to be consumer demand for that feature, so I expect that it will be popular and people will buy sets that have it, and when they shop for them on CNET and things like that, they'll read the review, or it'll be a touching point, and if it's something that people want, then it'll get included.
So Rob, the tonal mapping that the data that Dolby helps provide, is that set for just the peak setup of the display, or is there consideration for lower levels?
No, there's consideration that you're saying, Joel. So
yeah, well, the Dolby stuff is really cool. It's got a lot of knobs, and it can do a lot of.
They go up to 11, right?
The HDR10 stuff doesn't have very many knobs. It just basically has what the floor and the peak was, and so that's helpful. And in the mastering display gamut size, so that's very helpful. And HDR10 is going to be able to do some stuff with it to make sure that it translates well. But there's really no standard, no guidance on exactly how to do that right. And the Dolby Vision system has the guidance, it has more knobs, and should do a better job with it. Cool.
Thank you. I had a Vizio demo. I had a Vizio demo in Beijing of Dolby Vision Vizio, and there was a setting.
Vizio in Beijing. Huh. Anyways,
anyway, yes.
It's North American only product. I guess we shipped it over there probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did I just?
I was trying to figure out how it got there. That's all.
The one you sent me to.
A very rich man in Chinese.
Oh, it's right in our office.
Yeah. It was a demo in your office. But I was going to say, that question came up, and we were in a dark room, and I'm like, so are we just seeing this completely properly? And it did have a setting for I am in a dark room, and they actually had changed its peak output, so it wasn't blasting.
So one of the requirements for a Dolby Vision device is it must have we call it a reference mode, but we allow the TV manufacturer to set it, and that basically is put this in the exact standard of the SMPTE 2084 spec, and use the metadata as the artist said to replicate that artist environment.
No matter what.
No matter what. Right. Then the other mode is, we know you've got ambient issues in your home with your drapes open or whatever else. Pull it up so you can see a decent image. Right? So both of them will move that tonal mapping and the color gamut accurately, but give the user a control to say, give me absolute fidelity and I'll control my environment, or I need a little help so I can get an image that's worth sitting in front of.
Do the manufacturers do that, or do you provide that?
That is a requirement to have a Dolby Vision device. Interesting. You can't call it that unless you
No, but I mean for the lower settings. So I know that.
Oh, to go even darker.
No, like so. Yes, to go darker, not brighter. So.
Yeah, there's basically the reference setting that the artist used, which would mimic a DI suite.
Yeah.
And then anything above that, as the manufacturer wants to allow it to happen. Okay.
Well, guys, we could go on, obviously, for hours and hours and hours about this, but hopefully this sums up a little bit, or helps you figure out some of the details facing here. Can we get a really warm round of applause for our panel? So I'm sure the next year when we come back, all of these issues will have been figured out. Everybody will know what's going on with HDR. But until then, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the week and for attending Post-Production World, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.